Political morality accorded The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 1, Continued, Cassette 11, Side 2. Political morality accorded with the general moral laxity. Bribery was widespread, and worst at the top. Adulteration of goods was common, despite the live burial of 2 men at Nuremberg for adulterating wine in 1456. Commercialism, the sacrifice of morals to money, was as intense as in any age. Money, not man, was the measure of all things. Yet these same hustling burghers gave large sums to charity. In papal times, Luther wrote, men gave with both hands, joyfully and with great devotion. It snowed alms, foundations, and legacies. Our forefathers, lords and kings, princes and other folk, gave richly and compassionately, yes, to overflowing, to churches, parishes, burses, scholarships, hospitals. It was a sign of a secularizing age that many charitable bequests were left not to ecclesiastical bodies, but to town councils for distribution to the poor. Manners became coarser, in France and England as well as in Germany, when the plutocracy of money superseded the aristocracy of birth in controlling the economy. Drunkenness was the national vice. Both Luther and Hutten denounced it, though Hutten preferred it to the deceit of the Italians, the thievery of the Spaniards, the pride of the French. Some of the drinking may have been due to the sharp spices used in preparing meals. Table manners were rough and ready. Forks had come to Germany in the 14th century, but men and women still liked to eat with their fingers. Even in the 16th century, a preacher condemned forks as contrary to the will of God, who would not have given us fingers if he had wanted us to use forks. Dress was grandiose. Workmen were content with cap or felt hat, short blouse, and trousers overlapping or tucked into boots or high shoes. The middle classes added a vest and an open coat lined and or bordered with fur. But the possessors of pedigree competed feverishly with the collectors of guilders in the glory of their garb. In both these classes, the hats of the men were spacious involutions of costly cloth, sometimes trimmed with feathers, ribbons, pearls, or gold. Shirts were often of silk. Outer garments, brightly colored, were lined with fur and might be threaded with silver. Rich women wore crowns of gold or gold-embroidered hoods and braided gold thread into their hair, but modest maidens covered their heads with muslin handkerchiefs tied under the chin. Geiler von Kaisersberg alleged that smart women had wardrobes costing as much as 4,000 florins, or about $100,000. Men wore their chins shaved but their hair long. Male curls were carefully fostered. Note Durer's proud ringlets and Maximilian's fancy locks. Finger rings were a sign or pretense of class, as now. Conradus Celtus remarked that fashions in clothing changed more rapidly in Germany than elsewhere, and as often for men as for women. On festive occasions, the men might outshine the women in magnificence. Festivals were numerous, continuing the medieval spirit of make-believe and gay display, with a happy moratorium on labor and the commandments. Christmas was still Christian, despite its pagan vestiges. The Christmas tree was to be a 17th-century invitation. Every town celebrated a kermis, Dutch kerk, or church, and miss, or mass, or feast of its patron saint. Men and women would then dance together in the streets, merriment would be de rigueur, and no saint or preacher could abate the revel's rough hilarity. Dancing sometimes became an epidemic mania, as in Metz, Cologne, and Aix in 1374, or at Strasbourg in 1417. In some such cases, sufferers from St. Vitus's dance would seek relief from what they thought to be demoniacal possession by dancing themselves to exhaustion, as some young maniacs do today. Men found other outlets for their instincts in hunting or in the dying sport of the joust. Thousands of men and women traveled, often using a distant shrine as an excuse. They moved in painful delight on horses or mules or in coaches or sedan chairs, bearing the discomforts of unpaved roads and unwashed inns. Sensible persons, when they could, journeyed by boat along the Rhine, the Danube, or the other majestic streams of Central Europe. By 1500 a postal service, open to all, united the major towns. All in all, the picture is one of a people too vigorous and prosperous to tolerate any longer the manacles of feudalism or the exactions of Rome. A proud sense of German nationality survived all political fragmentation and checked supranational emperors as well as supernatural popes. The Reformation would defeat the Holy Roman Empire as well as the papacy. In the 1500-year war between Teuton and Roman, victory was once more, as in the 5th century, inclining toward Germany. 4. The maturing of German art. This coming of age first manifested itself in art. We may find it hard to believe, but it is true, that at the very height of the Italian Renaissance, from the birth of Leonardo in 1452 to the death of Raphael in 1520, German artists were in demand throughout Europe for their excellence in every craft, in wood, iron, copper, bronze, silver, gold, engraving, painting, sculpture, architecture. Perhaps with more patriotism than impartiality, Felix Fabry of Ulm wrote in 1484, "When anyone wishes to have a first-rate piece of workmanship in bronze, stone, or wood, he employs a German craftsman. I have seen German jewelers, goldsmiths, stone-cutters, and carriage-makers do wonderful things among the Saracens. They surpass even the Greeks and Italians in art." Some 50 years later, an Italian found this still true. "The Germans," wrote Paolo Giovio, "are carrying everything before them in art, and we, sluggish Italians, must needs send to Germany for good workmen." German architects were engaged by Florence, Assisi, Orvieto, Siena, Barcelona, and Burgos, and were called upon to complete the Duomo at Milan. Veit Stoss captivated Krakow, Durer received honors in Venice, and Holbein the Younger took England by storm. In ecclesiastical architecture, of course, the zenith had passed with the 13th and 14th centuries. Nonetheless, a single generation of Munich citizens raised in late Gothic their Frauenkirche, or Church of Our Lady, from 1468 to 1488, and the Altes Rathaus, or Old Town Hall, from 1470 to 1488. In the first 2 decades of the 16th century, Freiburg in Saxony completed its choir, Augsburg built the Fugger Chapel, Strasbourg Cathedral finished its Lawrence Chapel, and a lovely Chörlein, or oriel window, was added to the parsonage of the Sebalduskirche in Nuremberg. Domestic architecture in this period built charming cottages with red-tiled roofs, timbered upper stories, flower-decked balconies, and spacious eaves to protect the windows from sun or snow. So in Mittenwald's arduous climate, the undiscourageable Germans countered the sublimity of the Bavarian Alps with the simple and cherished beauty of their homes. Sculpture was the glory of the age. Minor carvers abounded who would have shone as major stars in a less brilliant galaxy. Nikolaus Gerhardt, Simon Leinberger, Tilman Riemenschneider, Hans Backofen. Nuremberg alone in one generation produced a trio of masters hardly surpassed in equal time by any town in Italy. The career of Veit Stoss was a tale of 2 cities. Nurtured in Nuremberg and acquiring fame as engineer, bridge builder, architect, engraver, sculptor, and painter, he went to Krakow at 30 and did his best work there in a flamboyant late Gothic style that well expressed both the piety and the excitability of the Poles. He returned to Nuremberg in 1496 with sufficient funds to buy a new house and marry a second wife, who bore him 5 children to add to her predecessor's 8. At the height of his abundance, Veit was arrested for having shared, perhaps unwittingly, in a forgery. He was branded by burning through both cheeks and was forbidden ever to leave Nuremberg again. The Emperor Maximilian pardoned him and restored his civic rights in 1506, but Stoss remained an outcast to the end of his painfully long life. In 1517 he carved a large group representing the Annunciation or angelical salutation. He enclosed the 2 figures, among the most nearly perfect in all the range of wood sculpture, in a garland of roses, surrounded this with a rosary, attached 7 medallions picturing the joys of the Virgin, and crowned the whole, all in linden wood, with an unprepossessing portrayal of God the Father. The fragile composition was suspended from the vault of the choir in the Lorenzkirche, where it still hangs as a treasured relic of the great city's halcyon days. For the Sebaldiskirche, Stoss carved in wood a crucifixion, never surpassed in its kind, this in 1520. In that year his son Andreas, as prior of the Nuremberg Carmelites, procured for Stoss a commission to design an altar for a church in Bamberg. While the artist labored on this assignment, the Reformation captured Nuremberg. Andreas was replaced as prior because he remained a Catholic. Veit himself clung to the colorful faith that had inspired his art. Payments on the altar commission were stopped, and the work remained incomplete. Stoss spent his final 10 years in blindness, solitude, and desolation, predeceased by his wives, abandoned by his children, and rejected by an age too absorbed in theology to recognize that it was losing, at 93, in 1533, the greatest woodcarver in history. A bronze worker equally supreme in his line lived in the same city and time, but led a quieter and happier life. Peter Vischer the Elder portrayed himself in a niche of his most famous product as an earnest, simple laborer, short, stocky, full-bearded, with a leather apron around his waist, and hammer and chisel in his hands. He and his 5 sons gave 11 years, from 1508 to 1519, to their chef-d'oeuvre, the Sebaldesgrab, or Tomb of Sebald, Nuremberg's patron saint. The enterprise was costly. Funds ran out, and the work lay unfinished when Anton Tucher roused the citizens to contribute the 800 guilders, or about $20,000, still required. This masterpiece is not impressive at first sight. It does not seem to rival Orcagna's Tabernacle from 1348 at Florence, and the snails and dolphins on whose backs the structure rests are not the likeliest carriers of so immense a weight. But a closer inspection reveals an astonishing perfection in the parts. The central sarcophagus of silver is adorned with 4 reliefs representing the miracles of the saint. Around it rise the bronze pillars of a Gothic canopy, delicately carved with Renaissance ornament, and joined in lovely metal lacery at the top. On the pillars, around the base, in the socles, in the niches of the crowning baldachin, the artists deposited a veritable population of pagan, Hebrew, or Christian figures, tritons, centaurs, nereids, sirens, muses, fauns, Hercules, Theseus, Samson, the prophets, Jesus, the apostles, and angels playing music or sporting with lions or dogs. Some of these effigies are still crude. Many are finished with the precision of a Donatello or a Ghiberti. All contribute vividly to a varied realization of life. The statues of Peter, Paul, Matthew, and John rival the 4 apostles that Durer painted some 7 years later in this same Nuremberg. No prince or potentate, we are told, came to Nuremberg in those first decades of the 16th century without visiting Peter Vischer's foundry, and many solicited his art. A score of churches displayed his products, from the great brass candelabra in the Lorenzkirche to the tomb of Maximilian I at Innsbruck. His 5 sons followed him in sculpture, but 2 preceded him in death. Hermann Vischer the Younger, who died at 31 in 1517, cast a handsome bronze relief for the tomb of Cardinal Casimir in the Cathedral of Krakow. As the Vischers excelled in bronze, and Veit Stoss in wood, so Adam Kraft led all his contemporaries in the sculpture of stone. German chroniclers pictured him and Peter Vischer the Elder and Sebastian Lindenast, who designed the obsequious electors in the Frauenkirche clock, as devoted artists and friends. They were like brothers. Every Friday, even in their old age, they met and studied together like apprentices, as the designs that they executed at their meetings prove. Then they separated, having quite forgotten to eat or drink. Born probably in the same year as Peter, about 1460, Adam resembled him in simplicity, honesty, piety, and fondness for self-portraiture. In 1492 he carved for the Sebaldiskirche the tomb of Sebaldus Schreier, with reliefs of the Passion and Resurrection. Moved by their excellence, Hans Imhoff, a merchant prince, commissioned Kraft to design a ciborium to hold the bread and wine of the Eucharist in the Lorenzkirche. Adam made this sacrament house a tall and slender tabernacle in late Gothic style, a miracle of stone filigree rising stage by stage to a height of 64 feet, and tapering to a graceful crozier-head curve. The pillars alive with saints, the doors of the house guarded by angels, the square surfaces cut in relief with scenes from the life of Christ, and the whole airy edifice resting anomalously on three crouching figures, Adam Kraft and two of his aides. There are no compliments in the self-portrait. The clothes are worn and torn with toil, the hands are rough, the beard is unkempt, the broad, uplifted face is intent upon the conception and execution of the work. When this absorbing masterpiece was finished, Kraft returned to his favorite subject by carving 7 sandstone pillars with scenes from the Passion. 6 of these are now in the Germanisches Museum. One of them, the Entombment, is typical of Teutonic art, a courageous realism that does not need idealization to convey a sincere piety and faith. The minor arts continued the same medieval moods and themes. Miniaturists were still in sufficient demand to maintain prosperous guilds. Major artists like Durer and Holbein drew designs for stained glass. This art, declining in France and England, now reached its apex in Germany. The Lorenzkirche, the cathedrals of Ulm and Cologne, received world-famous windows in this period. Not only churches, but guild halls, castles, even private homes had some windows of stained glass. Cities like Nuremberg, Augsburg, Regensburg, Cologne, and Mainz were proud of their craftsmen artists. Metalworkers who glorified torches, chandeliers, basins, ewers, locks, trays, goldsmiths whose products, from spoons to altars, were treasured throughout Europe, textile workers who wove fine carpets, tapestries, ecclesiastical vestments, and the ornate garb of the patrician class, devout women who wore out their fingers and eyes to cover altars, and priests with embroideries and silk. Woodcutters were never better. Michael Walgemuth, besides painting 2 magnificent windows for the Lorenzkirche, cut in wood a dozen altar masterpieces, and then taught Durer to surpass him. Engraving, by cutting a design into wood or copper, developed in the 15th century into a mature art, respected on a par with painting. The greatest painters cultivated it. Martin Schongauer carried it to completion. Some of his engravings, the Scourging of Christ, Carrying the Cross, St. John on Patmos, The Temptation of St. Anthony, are among the greatest of all time. Book illustration by engravings became convenient and popular, and rapidly replaced illumination. The most famous paintings of the period were multiplied in engravings that sold readily at bookstalls, fairs, and festivals. Lucas van Leyden showed an astonishing precocity in this field, engraving his Mohammed at 14, his Ecce Homo at 16, in 1510, and nearing perfection in his copper engraving of Maximilian. Dry-point engraving, by a pointed instrument throwing up a burr or ridge of excised metal along the lines of the design, was used by the anonymous Master of the House book toward 1480. Etching, by covering a metal surface with wax, cutting a design in the wax, and letting an acid eat, German ätzen, into the exposed lines, grew from the decoration of armor into the incision of metal plates from which etchings could be printed. Daniel Hopfer, an armorer, seems to have made the first recorded etching in 1504. Burgmeier and Durer practiced the new art imperfectly. Lucas van Leyden probably learned it from Durer, but soon went beyond him to mastery. In painting, this was Germany's greatest age. Influenced by both Dutch and Italian schools and by their own expatriated Memling, German painters in the second half of the 15th century graduated from Gothic intensity and ungainliness into a more graceful line and figures that moved with ease in natural scenes reflecting the domestic life of the triumphant bourgeoisie. Subjects remained predominantly sacred, but secular topics advanced. Altarpieces gave way to panel pictures, and rich donors, no longer satisfied to kneel in the corner of a religious group, demanded portraits in which they would be all in all. Painters themselves emerged from medieval anonymity into distinct individualities, signing their work with their names as a grasp at immortality. Still anonymous is the Master of the Life of the Virgin, who worked at Cologne toward 1470, and left a Virgin in St. Bernard with a very German virgin squeezing milk from her breast for the child, before a devout monk who hardly suggests the hound of heaven that pursued Abelard. Michael Packer is one of the first who transmitted his name as well as his work. The parish church of St. Wolfgang in Salzkammergut still shows the massive altarpiece, 36 feet long, that he carved and painted for it from 1479 to 1481. The study of perspective in these panels shared in the education of German art. Martin Schongauer brought into his painting the finesse of an accomplished engraver and the delicate sentiment of Rogier van der Weyden. Born at Augsburg, circa 1445, Schongauer settled in Colmar and developed there a school of engraving and painting that played a major role in bringing the arts to fulfillment in Durer and Holbein. Year by year, the thriving cities of the south stole the leadership of German art from Cologne and the north. At Augsburg, the center of the trade with Italy, Hans Burgkmair brought Italian decorative touches into his pictures, and Hans Holbein the Elder combined Italian ornament with the high seriousness of the Gothic style. Hans passed his art down to his sons, Ambroise and Hans, whom he fondly portrayed in his paintings. Ambroise faded from history, but Hans Jr. became one of the glories of Germany, Switzerland, and England. The greatest of Durer's predecessors was Matthias Gotthard Neihardt, who by a scholar's error became known to posterity as Matthias Grunewald. In the immemorial social heredity of art, he learned the painter's magic from Schongauer at Colmar, added his own hunger for fame and perfection, practiced patiently at Ghent, Speyer, and Frankfurt, and chose Strasbourg as his home in 1479. Probably there he painted his first master product, a double portrait of Philip II of Hanau-Lichtenberg and his wife. Durer himself would never excel this in depth of penetration and grace of execution. Wandering anew, Grunewald worked for a while with Durer at Basel, where he painted the portrait of a man, now in New York, and again with Durer making woodcuts in Nuremberg. In 1503 he settled at Seligenstadt, and there finally he developed his own mature and characteristic style, the graphic rendering of biblical scenes with passionate feeling and tragic power. Archbishop Albrecht made him court painter at Mainz in 1509, but dismissed him when Grunewald persisted in applauding Luther in 1526. He married, unfortunately, and withdrew into a melancholy solitude that may have lent some dark shades to the chiaroscuro of his art. His masterpiece, probably the greatest German painting, is the complex polyptych made for a monastery at Essen in 1513. The central panel shows the Virgin and her child in an almost Turner-esque glow of golden color against a background of distant seas. But the outstanding and unforgettable panel is a gruesome crucifixion. Christ in his final agony, the body covered with wounds and bloody sweat, the limbs distorted with pain, Mary swooning in the arms of St. John, Magdalene hysterical with angry and incredulous grief. Still other panels could be major paintings by themselves, a concert of angels in a Gothic architectural setting of brilliant reds and browns, a macabre temptation of St. Anthony, the same saint and a fellow anchorite in a weird forest of decaying trees, and a Boschian nightmare apparently symbolizing Anthony's dreams. In the predominance of color, light, and feeling over line, form, and representation, this almost theatrical outburst of pictorial power is the culmination of German Gothic painting on the eve of the triumph of line and logic in a Durer who, rooted in the mysticism of medieval Germany, stretched out hands of longing to the humanism and art of the Italian Renaissance. 5. Albrecht Durer, 1471 to 1528. No other nation has so unanimously chosen one of its sons as its representative in art as Germany. Protestant and Catholic, North and South, has chosen Durer. On April 6, 1928, the 400th anniversary of his death, the Reichstag in Berlin and the City Council in Nuremberg put aside politics and dogmas to honor the artist whom Germany loves best. Meanwhile, connoisseurs vainly offered $1 million for a painting, The Feast of the Rows of Garlands, for which Durer himself received 110 guilders, or about $2,750. His Hungarian father was a goldsmith settled in Nuremberg. Albrecht was the third of 18 children, most of whom died in infancy. In the parental studio, the boy learned to draw with pencil, charcoal, and pen, and to engrave with the burin. He taught himself to observe microscopically and to represent objects and subjects in indefatigable detail, so that in some of his portraits almost every hair seems to have received its individual stroke of the brush. The father had hoped that his son would be another goldsmith, but he yielded to the youth's desire to widen his art and sent him as an apprentice to Wolgemut in 1486. Albrecht developed slowly. His genius lay in ambition, perseverance, patience. "God lent me industry," he said, "so that I learned well, but I had to put up with a great deal of annoyance from his assistants." Having little opportunity to study the nude, he frequented the public baths and drew such Apollos as he could find there. He himself was something of an Apollo in those years. A friend described him fondly. "A body remarkable in build and stature, and not unworthy of the noble mind it contained. Face intelligent, eyes flashing, a long neck, broad chest, narrow waist, powerful thighs, steady legs. As to his hands, you would have said that you had never seen anything more elegant. And of his speech the sweetness was so great that one wished it would never end." Attracted by Schongauer's engravings, he made his way to Colmar in 1492, only to find that master was dead. He learned what he could from Schongauer's brothers, then passed on to Basel, where he absorbed from Grunewald the secret of intensely religious art. He was already a skilled draftsman. An edition of St. Jerome's Letters, printed at Basel in 1492, bore on its title page a portrait of the saint by Durer. And this was so acclaimed that several publishers competed for his future work. However, his father urged him to come home and marry. A wife had been chosen for him in his absence. He returned to Nuremberg and settled down to wedded life with Agnes Fry in 1494. A year earlier he had painted himself as a youth, garbed and coiffured almost like a woman, proud yet diffident, distrusting and defying the world. In 1498, still vain of his features, and now also of his beard, he painted his portrait as a young patrician, richly dressed, with tasseled cap and long brown curls. This is one of the great self-portraits of all time. In 1500 he pictured himself again, more simply costumed, the face elongated between masses of hair falling to the shoulders, the penetrating eyes mystically intent. Durer seems here to have deliberately presented himself in an imagined likeness of Christ, not in impious bravado, but presumably in his oft-voiced opinion that a great artist is an inspired mouthpiece of God. Vanity was the prop of his industry. He not only multiplied self-portraits, but found room for himself in many of his pictures. At times he could be modest and sadly conscious of his limitations. "When we are praised," he told Pirkheimer, "we turn up our noses and believe it all, but perhaps a master mocker is laughing at us behind our backs." For the rest, he was good-natured, pious, loyal, generous, and as happy as circumstances would permit. He could not have been infatuated with his wife, for he set out for Italy shortly after his marriage, leaving her behind. He had heard of what he called the regrowth of the arts in Italy after they had been in hiding for a millennium. And although he never intimately shared in that resurrection of classic literature, philosophy, and art which accompanied the Renaissance, he was anxious to see at first hand what it was that had given the Italians their excellence in painting and sculpture, in prose and poetry. He stayed chiefly in Venice, where the Renaissance had not yet reached full bloom, but when he came back to Nuremberg in 1495, he had somehow received the stimulus that sparked the rapid productivity of his next 10 years. In 1507, with a loan of 100 florins, or about $2,500, from Pirkheimer, he went again to Italy, and this time he stayed for a year and a half. He studied the works of Mantegna and Squarcione at Padua, copied drawings humbly, and was soon recognized by the Bellini and other Venetians as an accomplished draftsman. The Feast of the Rose Garlands, which he painted for a German church in Venice, won praise even from the Italians, who still considered most Germans to be barbarians. The Venetian signory offered him a permanent post if he would take up his residence there, but his wife and friends were importuning him to come back to Nuremberg. He noted that artists had won a much higher social standing in Italy than in Germany, and resolved to demand a similar status on his return. "Here," he wrote, "I am a fine gentleman. At home I am a parasite," that is, unproductive of material goods. He was delighted by the excitement of art in Italy, the number and conflict of artists, the learned and passionate discussions of art theories. When Jacopo de Barbari expounded to him the principles of Piero della Francesca and other Italians on the mathematical proportions of a perfect human body, Durer remarked that he would rather have had this explained to him than to have received a new kingdom. In Italy he became accustomed to the nude in art, if only by studying classic statuary. While his own work remained thoroughly Teutonic and Christian, he adopted with enthusiasm the Italian admiration for pagan art, and in a long sequence of writings he strove to teach his countrymen the Italian secrets of perspective, proportion, and coloring. With these two trips of Durer to Italy, the Gothic style came to an end in German painting, and the same German generation that rejected Rome in religion accepted Italy in art. Durer himself remained in a creative but confusing tension between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, between German mysticism and Italian worldliness, and the joy of life that he had seen in Italy never quite overcame in his soul the medieval meditation on death. Except for his portraits, his subjects remained almost wholly religious and many mystical. Nevertheless, his real religion was art. He worshipped the perfect line more than the imitation of Christ. Even in his religious productions, he showed the artist's driving interest in all the objects of even the most common daily experience. Like Leonardo, he drew nearly everything that he saw: rocks, streams, trees, horses, dogs, pigs, ugly faces and figures, and imaginary beings of marvelous or horrible form. He drew his left leg as seen in diverse positions, and punched a pillow into 7 different shapes to be studied by his indefatigable pen. He crowded his work with a veritable menagerie of animals, and sometimes he drew a whole city as a background for a picture. He illustrated with relish and humor the life and doings of country folk. He loved the Germans, painted their enormous heads and rubicund features without protest, and introduced them into the unlikeliest environments, always richly robed like prosperous burghers, and wrapped and muffled, even in Rome or Palestine, against the German cold. His drawings are an ethnography of Nuremberg. His chief patrons were its merchant princes, whom he rescued from death with his portraits, but he received commissions also from dukes and imperial electors, and at last from Maximilian himself. As Titian loved best to portray the nobility and royalty, Durer was most at home in the middle class, and his woodcut of the emperor made him look like what Louis XII had called him, the burgomaster of Augsburg. Once only Durer achieved nobility in a portrait, an imaginary rendering of Charlemagne. The 36 portraits are his most readily enjoyable works, for they are simple, sensual, earthy, swelling with character. Behold Hieronymus Holzschuer, the Nuremberg senator, a powerful head, stern face, thinning hair on a massive forehead, a beard trimmed to immaculate symmetry, sharp eyes as if watching politicians, yet with the beginning of a twinkle in them. Here is a man with a good heart, good humor, good appetite. Or consider Durer's dearest friend, Willibald Pirkheimer, the head of a bull concealing the soul of a scholar and suggesting the gastric needs of Gargantua. And who would guess, behind the creased and flattened features of the immense Frederick the Wise of Saxony, the elector who defied a pope to protect Luther? Nearly all the portraits are fascinating. Oswald Krell, whose earnest concentration shows even in the veins of his hands, or Bernhard von Resten, with the delicate blue blouse, the majestic overspreading hat, the meditative eyes of an absorbed artist, or Jakob Muffel, burgomaster of Nuremberg, a brown study of earnest devotion, shedding some light on the greatness and prosperity of the city. Or the 2 portraits of Durer's father, weary with toil in 1490, quite worn out in 1497, or the portrait of a gentleman in the Prado, virility incarnate, tarnished with cruelty and greed, or Elizabeth Tucker holding her wedding ring and gazing diffidently into marriage, or the portrait of a Venetian lady. Durer had to go to Italy to find beauty as well as strength. There is seldom refinement in his male portraits, no elegance, only force of character. What is not useful in a man, he said, is not beautiful. He was interested in reality and its faithful transcription, rather than in beauty of forms or features. He pointed out that an artist can draw or paint a beautiful picture of an ugly object or disagreeable subject. He was a Teuton, all industry, duty, fidelity. He left beauty and grace to the ladies and concentrated on power. Painting was not his forte, nor much to his taste, but his visits to Italy stirred him to seek color as well as line. For Frederick of Saxony and his castle church in Wittenberg, he painted a triptych later known as the Dresden altarpiece. Here Italian modes of proportion and perspective framed figures resolutely German. A Frau as the Virgin, a professor as St. Anthony, a German acolyte as St. Sebastian. The result is not irresistible. Finer is the Baumgärtner altarpiece in Munich, a splendid St. Joseph and a Midcan Mary against an architectural background of Roman ruins. But the foreground is littered with absurd mannequins. The adoration of the Magi in the Uffizi is a triumph of color in the Virgin's blue robe and the gorgeous vestments of the Oriental kings. Christ among the Doctors shows a pretty Jesus with girlish curls, surrounded by bearded and wrinkled pundits, one a horrible caricature, all nose and teeth. The Feast of the Rose Garlands rivaled the greatest Italian pictures of the time in its skillfully ordered composition, the loveliness of both mother and child, the general splendor of the color. This is Durer's greatest painting, but one must now venture all the way to Prague to see it. Vienna and Berlin have attractive Dürer Madonnas, and the New York Madonna and Child with St. Anne presents a tender German maiden as the Virgin and a dark-skinned Semite as her mother. Excellent are the Prado panels of Adam and Eve. Here, for a moment, a German artist has rendered the beauty of a healthy female nude. Discouraged by inadequate remuneration for the labor of painting, and perhaps by the compulsion to repeat old religious themes, Dürer turned increasingly to the more gainful and original work of woodcutting and engraving. For there one plate could make 1,000 copies easily carried to every market in Europe, and could provide the same illustration for 1,000 printed volumes. Line was Dürer's forte, drawing was his realm, wherein no man then alive surpassed him. There even the proud Italians marveled at his finesse. Erasmus compared him as a draftsman with an ancient master of line. Apelles was aided by color, but Dürer, though admirable also in other respects, what does he not express in monochrome, proportions, harmonies? Nay, he even depicts that which cannot be depicted: fire, rays of light, thunder, lightning, all the sensations and emotions, in fine the whole mind of man as it reflects itself in the behavior of the body, and almost the voice itself. These things he places before the eyes in the most pertinent lines, black ones, yet so that if you should spread pigments on them you would injure the work. And is it not more wonderful to accomplish without the blandishments of color what Apelles accomplished with their aid? Dürer returned the compliment by engraving a portrait of Erasmus in 1526, not from the living sitter, but from the painting by Massais. It did not rival that portrait, much less Holbein's. Even so, it is a masterpiece of drawing in the folds and shadows of the cloak, the wrinkles of face and hands, the ruffled leaves of the open book. Dürer has left us over 1,000 drawings, most of them miracles of realistic or pious or impishly fanciful design. Some are obvious caricatures. One is age and wisdom drawn to a hair. Occasionally the subject is inanimate, as in the wire drawing mill, or just plain vegetation, like a piece of turf, or an animal, like head of a walrus. Usually plants and beasts crowd around living persons, as in the complex Madonna with a multitude of animals. The religious subjects are the least successful, but we must accept and honor the remarkable hands of a praying apostle. And lastly, there are fine studies of classic mythology, like the Apollo or the Orpheus. Dürer transformed some 250 of his drawings into woodcuts, and 100 into gravings. These two groups are the most distinctive portions of his legacy. Until the turn of the century, he incised the designs himself. Later he delegated the woodcutting to others. Only by this collaboration could he have delineated so vast an area of life. He began by illustrating books like Der Ritter von Thurn and Sebastian Brandt's Narrenschiff. 20 years afterward he drew fascinating border figures for the prayer book of Maximilian. He tried his pen at nudes and succeeded handsomely in the men's bath, not so well in the women's bath. In both he served as a revolutionary force in a German art that had shunned the nude as a scandal or a disillusionment. Famous were the woodcuts that portrayed the life of the Virgin and the Passion of Christ. Devout women could now contemplate by their own hearths a print showing the betrothal of Joseph and Mary, and practical Germans were pleased to find, in the sojourn of the Holy Family in Egypt, all the cozy details of Teutonic domesticity and industry: Mary sewing, Joseph working at his bench, and angelic children bringing in firewood without being asked. 37 small woodcuts, the Little Passion, and 11 larger ones, the Great Passion, brought the story of the sufferings and death of Christ into thousands of homes, and whetted the public appetite for Luther's translation of the New Testament. Another series illustrated the Book of Revelation. Some of these woodcuts, like the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse and St. Michael fighting the dragon, were so vivid that for centuries the German mind thought of the Apocalypse in terms of Durer's prints. From woodcuts he passed to the more painstaking art of engraving. Now and then he tried dry-point etching, as in the chiaroscuro Holy Family. Usually he worked with the burin. The fall of man is sculpture on copper, in forms worthy of the Greeks, in proportion and symmetry worthy of the Italians, with Durer's customary profusion of fauna and flora, where nearly every item held for him and his generation a symbolical significance. Nude females of an excellence unprecedented in German art emerged from the metal in The Sea Monster, and The Combat of Virtue and Pleasure, with background landscapes beautifully drawn. The 16 engravings constituting the engraved Passion are less impressive than the woodcut Passions, but the St. Eustace is a cornucopia of vivid designs. 5 dogs, a horse, a forest, a swarm of birds, a congeries of castles on a hill, a stag bearing a crucifix between his antlers, and persuading the handsome hunter to leave off killing and become a saint. In 1513-14, Durer reached his summit as a draftsman in 3 Meisterstücke, master engravings. The Knight, Death, and the Devil is a powerful version of a somber medieval theme. A stern-faced rider in full armor on a Verrocchian steed, hemmed in by ugly figures of death and Satan, but moving forward resolutely to the triumph of virtue over all. It seems incredible that such plenitude and delicacy of detail could be cut into metal. St. Jerome in his study shows a quieter phase of the Christian victory. The old bald saint bent over his manuscript, writing apparently by the light of his halo, a lion and a dog lying peacefully on the floor, a skull sitting in silent eloquence on a windowsill, and what looks for all the world like his wife's hat hanging on the wall. The whole room drawn in the most careful perspective, with all shadows and sun rays meticulously drawn. Finally, the engraving that Durer entitled Melancholia I reveals an angel seated amid the chaos of an unfinished building, with a medley of mechanical tools and scientific instruments at her feet, a purse and keys attached to her girdle as emblems of wealth and power, her head resting pensively on one hand, her eyes gazing half in wonder, half in terror about her. Is she asking to what end all this labor, this building and demolition and building, this pursuit of wealth and power and the mirage called truth, this glory of science and babble of intellect, vainly fighting inevitable death? Can it be that Durer, at the very outset of the modern age, understood the problem faced by triumphant science, of progressive means abused by unchanging ends? So, drawing by drawing, painting by painting, with an arduous industry and patience so different from Leonardo's procrastination and Raphael's ease, Durer passed into the age of Luther. About 1508 he bought the house that made Nuremberg famous. The Second World War destroyed it. The tourist trade rebuilt it as a copy of the original. Its 2 lower stories were of stone, the 3rd and 4th of pink stucco and half timber, and over a projecting eave 2 further stories crouched under the gabled roof. Here for 19 years Durer lived in moderate misery with his childless wife. Agnes was a simple hausfrau who wondered why Albrecht spent so much time on unremunerative studies or with bibulous friends. He moved in circles beyond her mental reach, neglected her socially, traveled most often without her, and when he took her to the Netherlands, dined with celebrities or with his host while leaving his wife to eat in the upper kitchen with their maid. In 1504 his widowed mother joined Durer's household. She persisted 10 years more. His portrait of her moves our sympathy for the wife, who was not too charming herself. His friends considered Agnes a shrew, incapable of sharing Durer's rapt intellectual life. In his later years the Nuremberg master enjoyed a European fame as the leader and glory of German art. This book is continued on Cassette 12, Side 1.